All right. This is Sri Chalapa with Engagedly, and this is our People and Strategy Insights webinar. And today we have Dr. Matt Poepsel, who's going to be talking about transforming the employee relationship. So basically, we want to build a better bridge so that we have a better employee relationship and maximize the engagement and ultimately save the world, as Matt puts it. So with that, I would like to introduce Matt. Please, if you don't mind, give you a brief background and we can jump right in.
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much, Sri. I appreciate the opportunity, and thanks everybody for joining today. My name is Matt, and I'm a leadership guy. I've been around and leading people and teams in software companies and growth companies for a long, long time. And I just thought I would love to be able to share some of my insights today, some wet paint, some brand new stuff. All right, very good. So let's go ahead and just jump right in. So not to start with something too obvious, but it's very clear that the business environment has changed. I can't even name all the different things that we're experiencing today between the pandemic and remote and hybrid work and digital transformation and all these things. And, from my perspective, employers have done a fabulous job, have really bent over backwards to try to meet the needs of employees, even though they've been shifting so dramatically. And I think that if you look at this example here from Zenefits of some of the top benefits, when you look at things like 5 and 6 with flexible scheduling and options to continue working remotely and even flexible part-time, paid time off, we're doing everything that we can to try to say to the workers, we know you're going through some things, and we want to make sure that we're here for you. There's just one problem, and that's the fact that it's just absolutely not working. What we're seeing is that employees are continuing to quit at a record pace. This is from SHRM, and they talk about 4.5 million employees per month in the US alone are choosing to walk away from their work. And now, if you think about 4.5 million, if you took 4.5 million pay stubs and you line them up end to end, they would stretch from Manhattan all the way to Chicago. It's unbelievable, the numbers, and obviously it's unprecedented, and it's continuing. So this is going to stay at an elevated rate for the foreseeable future as we're seeing this dramatic shift all over the place. And so we start to ask ourselves, why is this happening? At the same time, when we look at Gallup's polls, then we saw for the first time in a decade that we saw employee engagement drop. And these numbers don't move a ton, but this was pretty significant. And what they found is that the middle of the organizations, the managers, directors, et cetera, are the ones really taking it on the chin because the executives can't see change fast enough, right? When are we going to get this change, digital transformation, all these shifts? We want to take advantage of them. But with so much change, the employees are frustrated and they don't know how things are supposed to get done. And the managers in the middle are kind of caught being ground to little bits. So employee engagement is rough for a lot of people right now. And we just have to be mindful of that. At the same time, what we're seeing is a tremendous decline in employee mental wellness. And you can see in this example, 31% have said that their mental health has declined over the past year, which is an increase in that rate. And leaving this corporate wellness to explain that employees' mental health is at an all-time low. And that's obviously something that we're very, very concerned about. And I see more and more of an interest in trying to provide access to programs and guidance and things, but it's clear that, more needs to be done. Probably just as concerning and certainly just as concerning is the HR team. So struggling to keep up, in this case, talking about 98%. That's a relatively high number, Sri. 98% fatigued and under pressure. Now, these are the people that business leaders like myself count on whenever we step in it and we make mistakes with employees. These are the people we're counting on to put it back together, right? The HR professionals, talent professionals, I like to call them, fatigued and under pressure, feeling overwhelmed and saying that they're dreading going back to work. The candidate pipelines are thinner than ever. And there's so much pressure to say, get these hires made, figure out this remote work thing. It's really unprecedented and it's absolutely taking a toll. And unfortunately, the problem is probably just a little bit worse than we seem. When you think about a worker who's having a tough time at work, who bears the brunt of that? Certainly coworkers. All of a sudden, I'm a little shorter with the people when I can't get my goals met or I'm frustrated by something. And that creates this sort of a downward spiral inside organizations. At the same time, our frontline employees, when they're working with customers, if the customer's a little bit rude or something, or maybe it triggers them a little bit, they could take it out on the customer. And probably the saddest thing is that when you have a bad day at work and you go home to your family, you're not your best for the people who who care about the most. And so when we think about families and bearing the brunt of that worker discontent, that's another major challenge. When we start to look at why is this happening, unfortunately, we see this tremendous divide between employers and employees with different perspectives and opinions about why this is happening in the first place. This is some research that came out of McKinsey. So this is an example. If you look on a chart like this on the bottom right-hand side, this is where employers are saying these things are important and employees are like, not so much. And you see things on the right-hand column like compensation, better job, et cetera. But it's the light blue that we care about most. These are areas where the employees are saying, this is important to us. And the employers are not acknowledging and don't appreciate how important it is to the employees. So this is where that gap is starting to be seen. Look at these types of things, being valued by the organization, being valued by my manager, feeling a sense of belonging, right? Having caring and trusting teammates. These are the things that are driving employees, but the employers haven't caught up to that just yet. And that becomes a part of the challenge. So when we start to pull this back, and I've started to take a bit of a broader view here, I have recognized that the real issue is that we have these modern workers facing modern challenges, but it is absolutely a timeless challenge. Back in 1943, Abraham Maslow came up with a hierarchy of needs. It's pretty well understood that as we have needs, according to this, we want as human beings to satisfy these needs. And so at the very bottom, you see the most basic needs that we have, physiological needs. If you don't allow your employees to have access to lunch, for example, it's going to be hard for them to concentrate in the afternoon. That's pretty straightforward. But what happens is we work to satisfy these needs in an increasing fashion. So once my food needs are there, then now all of a sudden I'm ready to move on to my safety and security needs. And once those are met, now I'm like, well, I might like to have some friends. I'm feeling a little bit lonely about this, and so on and so forth, all the way up a diagram like this. And the way that I like to think about it is that when you bring it into the organizational context, this represents a continuum. The most basic needs, you could consider these to be essential needs. These are the types of needs that certainly the paycheck and these things are going to be very rudimentary and basic, and they've just got to be there for somebody to really show up properly at work. In the middle is where it gets really interesting, where we talk about experiential needs. And I would say this is where employers, in my perspective, spend a lot of time. They think a lot about what's the employee experience like, what's the candidate experience like, what's happening with our employee experience surveys and engagement surveys and these sorts of things. And that's really important to be able to understand that, because a lot of times if we don't take a look objectively at the experience we're providing, we could miss things. But what the employees, I should say, are saying to us is that they have moved beyond just the experiential needs, and they've moved to something that I consider existential needs. So now we're getting into areas you can see around self-actualization, about one's full potential. You can think about purpose and meaning and these things. And so there's this continuum, but I think that the employee demand to be able to meet their needs has outstripped where the employers are. And that's another way of looking at the information that we just saw from McKinsey. Now, it's important to point out that humans have always worked, right? We've always wanted to meet our needs from cave person days all the way till present day. And through all these waves, when you think about hunter-gatherer society, you're talking about thousands of years that humans spent in that phase. And then agrarian society said, you know what, I'm tired of working so hard to catch my food. I'm going to go out and plant some things and settle down for a little bit. That's another thousands and thousands of years. And then even as recently as the industrial age, and when you start thinking about textile mills and these sorts of things in 1700s, 1800s, there's always been this progression. And what I think is interesting is if you took the benefits that we highlighted a little bit earlier, and you showed those to somebody who was working in one of those textile mills as an example, and you said, let's take a look at number 7. We're going to offer you in the future pet insurance. Can you imagine what the reaction would be if you said to somebody working in a steel mill back then, we're going to have pet insurance? Or we don't have pets. What are you talking about? Nobody can afford pets. Like we're fighting for our lives on the job here. Or if you said, okay, how about number 4? We're going to give you childcare assistance. They said, we barely have child labor laws. Like if you give this set of benefits to these industrial age type workers, they would say, where do I sign up? Where do I sign up? This is amazing. The future is absolutely amazing. And yet when we're offering these types of benefits to our employees, they're saying, no, thank you. And they're quitting. So all that says to us is that the evolution of the needs continues. It's a bar that continues to raise. So if all of a sudden the employees are looking for more and more, and they're saying, I can get a paycheck anywhere in this current market. I can work remotely, so I can work anywhere I'd like. I can set my hours. You're not giving me something I can't get somewhere else, but there's still something that I'm missing. And I say that existential human needs, the very top of that pyramid, is what's left to satisfy. And it comes down to what I call the 3 Bs, which is being, belonging, and something bigger than myself. And so a question for being, as an example, who am I really? Especially when you think about, it can happen at any phase of the employment life cycle, but when you think about early career professionals, what is my purpose? What's my meaning? Why am I here? These are questions that they absolutely are experiencing, but coming to work is not necessarily helping them answer that question. What about belonging? Where do I fit in? If you think about in the past, we would have had a very close family ties. We would have had, and now families live halfway across the country. We would have had very strong relationships with neighbors. And now we barely talk to the DoorDash delivery person. Like, come on, what are we talking about? So a sense of belonging is really difficult to come by. When you think about church going, the latest Generation Z is the least likely to go to church and feel that that's important in their lives, but everybody goes to work. What sort of sense of belonging are they experiencing when they come to work becomes the question. And how about something bigger than myself? Where do I get that impact? How do I measure the something that's beyond just my little world here? How is work helping me connect with that? And in fact, these 3 Bs are so important that I call them the killer bees, because when they are unmet, they kill all kinds of important things. They kill productivity, they kill focus and engagement, and so on and so forth, all the way down to intent to stay. If we don't find a way to satisfy being and belonging and bigger than myself needs, then we're not as high up on the needs hierarchy as what our employees are looking for. And in many cases, they don't even know to ask themselves these questions. They just feel this something that they can't really identify, but we know better, right? We've been through this, and it's not surprising when you study and know as much as you do about psychology as we do, and as much about the workplace. We have an opportunity here. But unfortunately, today, we've got this real divide. On the employer side, we spend a ton of time thinking about the technical needs of the business. We think about something like digital transformation and disruption and a shift to hybrid work and the rise of AI and machine learning and these things. And if we think about employees at all, I don't want to say at all, but if we think about employees, we think about the experiential, as we talked about a little bit earlier. So we're kind of at a more basal level than where they are. On the right-hand side, the employees themselves, they're feeling and experiencing very human emotions, especially coming out of the pandemic. It made them reprioritize their values. It made them think about what's most important in their lives and decisions they were making with their time. And they're like, I'm investing my life. And now do I really want to hop in the car and be in a commute for 45 minutes just to be on Zoom half the day? These are questions they're starting to ask themselves in a way they weren't, 2 years ago. And so some of those existential questions have bubbled up to the surface. And I think that's a big part of what's showing up in the McKinsey data, saying, look at the gap when you're seeing that light blue area again, where employees are saying, this is important to us, and the employers haven't caught up yet. And saying, how do I have these caring and trusting teammates? That's your belonging needs. How do I feel valued by my manager? That's my being needs, et cetera. This is an opportunity for us. And so that brings us to the topic of the webinar when we talk about the bridge. Leadership is the bridge. Who's in a better position than a frontline manager or someone's direct supervisor to help create that connection? Leadership is all about connection, and to help make that connection between the individual and what their strengths are, what they're working on, all these kinds of things. Leadership can be that bridge, but we're going to have to take a little bit of a different approach to leadership than we have in the past. Now, I've had the opportunity to study authentic leadership, transformational leadership, servant leadership, all of it. And it's all really good stuff. But I think when we get to these existential needs and we've evolved to this point, we have to look to the future and ask ourselves, what type of leadership is going to have the greatest impact? With a team that developed a framework called talent optimization, this was in 2018. And talent optimization is an amazing framework because it shows our leaders what they need to do in organizations. When you look at the business strategy on the left, let's say you start your business strategy in January. By the time December comes and you're on the far right with business results, very few organizations find that the results match what their original strategic intent was. And that's because this middle part, which is the people part, sometimes gets skipped. And so talent optimization as a framework tells our leaders, what do they need to do? They have to be able to design winning teams. The most interesting work in organizations is team-based work. Designing winning teams is critically important. They also have to hire top talent. And right now, hiring is really challenging, but in any environment, hiring is incredibly important. And leaders need to be able to understand, how do I do this effectively with a people first lens, I would call it. The next is, how do I inspire my employees to greatness? This is the domain of things like the privileged relationship that a manager has with his or her direct reports. It has to do with career pathing, et cetera. And finally, diagnose. How do I diagnose people problems that are affecting the business? And how do I get those fixed as quickly as possible? That's a bridge that leaders can use to connect business strategy to business results in that people first lens. And there are amazing solutions out there, for example, like Engagedly, tying specifically to the diagnose bit. When we start talking about performance management, employee engagement, a critical view of data that we can use to understand people problems that are affecting an organization. Or a solution like Mentoring Complete, when we start talking about connecting people with individuals who can help them understand career paths, skill sets, development, support resources, unbelievable stuff when it comes to inspire, again, in a talent optimization framework. So talent optimization has come along to really show leaders what to do. And it's been incredibly well received by both talent professionals and by business leaders, because it gives sort of a communication framework or a translation layer between either being too focused on the technical aspects of the business, or a little bit too much focused on the people aspects. We need that intersection. And that's what talent optimization uniquely does for us. And that's why we can look at solutions like Engagedly and Mentoring Complete to help us get it right. From my perspective, I think there's also now, when we look at the top of that pyramid, a chance to go even further. And so you can see early look up here, because this is the first time I've ever had a chance to kind of package and present my current thoughts about this. And I have this leadership approach I've developed that I call Expand the Circle. I'm currently researching a book project I'm writing. It'll come out next year sometime. And I want to share with you some of the early findings that I'm coming across, and also give you a chance to talk about some ways that, how it relates to the leadership framework itself. Now, I'll explain it like this. Expand the Circle is what I would consider a layered leadership approach in this way. What I teach when I'm working with leaders is that you have to start with yourself. You have to understand and work hard on yourself and your own leadership before you can really start to branch out to the next level and the next level and the next level. But once you've gone through and you've done the hard work and you've at least started to make some progress, you may not master it, but you've made some good progress about leading yourself, you then branch out to talk about leading others, one-on-one relationships. And when I say leading others, it doesn't just mean having a direct report. It could mean having a peer relationship. It could mean working with your boss, whatever it might be. But there's a leadership approach that you can take with others that's also included as you now expand the circle out from yourself. The next layer out, we start talking about leading teams. And again, teams doing really important work inside organizations, critically important. And so what happens within the team, something we'll talk about. And then finally, going a little bit further out than the boundaries of the team, you reach the entire organization. And this doesn't mean just top down, like only executives get to lead organizations. No, what we find is that leaders at every level have an opportunity to reinforce the way that the organization is doing its work. And they have a very critical role to play in terms of organizational leadership. And then finally, when you leave the boundary of the organization itself, what we're finding is that there's this impact that organizations have even beyond their boundaries. And so I call that leading the world. So when you look at this Expand the Circle framework, what we find is that it progresses in these sequences of moving from leading yourself all the way out through to leading in the world. So let's take a little bit of a deeper look into this. When I start to think about leading yourself, in my research, I found 5 specific topic areas that are really that comprise this. And I like to begin with self-awareness. I like to think about things like self-acceptance, moving on to self-confidence, et cetera. And it kind of progresses through as we go through this. Something like integrity, when I use it in this sense, means the structural integrity or the wholeness of what you're bringing work. Can you really bring your full self and your full capacity to the leadership moment? That's what that means. And then transcendence is when you start to realize as a leader that you've worked really hard on yourself, but that it's not just about you. You have to actually start to shift that leadership into something that's outside of yourself. And so I'll give you a quick example. There was a gentleman who was at a grocery store, right? Very typical day, walking through the aisles and looks down on the ground and notices some spilled sugar and thinks to himself, oh my gosh, somebody has a bag of sugar in their cart that's probably got a hole in it. I should definitely go let them know how this is, that they had this issue. So starts walking up and down the aisles looking for this person who's creating this gigantic mess, only to come to find out the bag of sugar was in his own cart. So he had the punctured bag of sugar, and he's thinking, oh my gosh, I'm the one who's making the mess. This was like an aha moment for him. Now, he happened to be a philosopher of all things, a little bit like myself. So that led him to call into question all these things about how do we become aware of things? And it's really interesting to start thinking, how many of our leaders inside of the organization where you work are spilling sugar all over the place? My sugar tends to be not being great with the details and just coming off, kind of half cocked and saying, hey, here's a great idea. Let's do this. Isn't that amazing? And then my team is like, no, that's not amazing. We're really busy right now. You should probably think more about that before you speak. Starting with self-awareness is a great place for leaders to understand sort of, how we can start to identify what we're all about and what we're bringing to the table when it comes to how we show up as leaders. Another example is when we look at leading others. Now, all of a sudden, we look at things like empathy, altruism. So empathy, as an example, is how we understand and can internalize what other people might be feeling. Altruism is all about how am I willing to expend resources and energy and even put myself at risk when the benefit is going to go to another person. And if you want to talk about a definition of leadership, that's a big one in my book. Trust, pretty self-explanatory. Fairness. We talk a ton about fairness today in terms of DEIB and really, really important things. We're also seeing that there's a need for fairness. And I have been researching the roots of fairness. And what I'm finding is that fear is what drives a lot of anti-fairness or a lot of a lack of fairness. But we're seeing a need for fairness in the area of also around things like neurodiversity and other important considerations as well. And then finally, this concept of interconnectedness. There's amazing science taking place right now, understanding the hidden social connections that we as humans have with one another. And kind of the tagline I saw the other day was that your friends' friends can make you fat. And I'm like, well, that's interesting. I'm going to pull on that thread a little bit. But there's definitely a connection that we can't always see it, but it's there. And I think that's an important thing to remember when it comes to leading others. One example came from Stephen M.R. Covey. He's the son of Stephen Covey of 7 Habits fame. And he had written this book about speed of trust. And it really has done a lot of great thinking and writing about trust. And I found this equation that he had shared pretty interesting, where it talks about strategy times execution times trust equals results. What that means in psychology nerd terms like myself is that trust has this mediating effect on what else we might do when it comes to strategy and execution. So when in terms of leading others, as a manager, as an example, I'm responsible for job definition. And I say, here's the work that needs to be done. I hire somebody to do that work, and they're going to go off and do that job. But the extent of trust, where trust is high, it can actually enhance the results that we get. But where that trust is low, everything's going to slow down. Its results are going to be watered down. And now all of a sudden, even if I have a very well-laid strategy and plan and job description, and I've got exactly the right work lined up, even if that person executes it really well, but there's not trust between us, we're not going to get the result in the same way that there's potential for that thing. And so this is where trust becomes really critical to the business result. And there's a lot of other social driver reasons for this as well. Now, leading your team, we take another step out. We talk about things like vision. How do I start to create and communicate a compelling view of our shared objective as a team? Right? How do I say, this is the opportunity that we have, and here's why we need to do this, and sort of generate some enthusiasm for it. Team identity is really important. When I start thinking about teams and I say, give me an example of a team that you're on. These types of things are interesting because some teams are like, well, I'm on the finance team. You're like, is that really like motivating to be on the finance team? How do we think about that? Cooperation, obviously the ability to work with one another, and then safety. A lot of talk right now about psychological safety, the manager's role in creating safety, what happens when we don't have that and experience that as employees, and how we begin to shut down. These are important things. So here's an example. So this is from a nature reserve in Myanmar, where there was a group of 9 elephants, and the researchers there decided to set up an experiment. And they created a table that had 2 trays of bananas on the table. Apparently elephants love bananas. I didn't know that. And they had a wall between the elephants and the food. And they took a rope and they extended it through the wall and through the table and back through the wall again, such that if any elephant pulled on the rope, it would just slip through the table and it wouldn't move and they couldn't reach the bananas. But what they found is that when 2 elephants each grabbed an end of the rope and they both pulled on the rope, it would draw the table closer and they could reach their trunks over the wall and eat the bananas. What was interesting is that apparently they don't have a lot to do, these researchers, across 1,800 trials, what they found is that 80% of the time, the elephants would cooperate and work together to get to the bananas. And they learned very quickly that cooperation would net them a bigger result, which is pretty cool. So I was like, oh, that's pretty amazing. So they learned to work together in various combinations across these teams of elephants, and cooperation helped them to enjoy the food. But unfortunately, there's a twist. The psychologists also decided then, what happens if we only have 1 tray of bananas? They could evenly divide the bananas, no problem, but what happens? And what they found is that in the presence of scarcity, the elephants would not cooperate. They would begin to block each other out. They'd aggressively attack one another. Some would withdraw, some would submit, but all these counterproductive behaviors that would lead to an erosion of cooperation. And the willingness to cooperate in that scenario fell to 0 almost immediately. And so when we think about our own organizations, hopefully we have the common sense of elephants to cooperate in the first place. But what is scarce in our organizations? When you think about scarcity of resources, all the time, no company has unlimited resources. And in organizations, goals can be very complex. How are we going to have product innovation, but also have product quality outcomes? Are we going to hire more R&D engineers? Or are we going to hire more QA professionals? Like, these types of things have to be decided. What about in the case of recognition and praise? There can be scarcity of that as well. Not everybody can be announced. So all of a sudden, will we see the same levels of cooperation? And what about just time and attention to whatever it is that you're working on versus what someone else is working on? These lead to an erosion of a cooperation if a leader doesn't take steps to make sure that they're addressed. So leading your team becomes critically important. When we think about leading organizations, we see things like mission and values and culture and alignment and all these sorts of things as well. And I'll give you an example here of what I found with culture. There's 3 different types of culture design, I like to call it, when we talk about inauthentic, inadvertent, and intentional. If we start at the far right with intentional culture, this is when there's been a deliberate chance from the top down to say, let's say the executive team working with the people operations team and saying, what type of culture do we want to have here? What's going to align with our strategy? What really reflects our core values? That's the best case scenario, that we are intentional about that design. We reinforce it with every hire we make, et cetera. More common from what in my experience, is this middle one of inadvertent. Inadvertent culture means we haven't really paid a lot of thought to it. It's just kind of bubbled up on its own. It's something that really reflects just what organizations sort of tend to have as far as attitudes and behaviors go. And it's just kind of happenstance. It's accidental, if you will. That happens, far too often, but it's understandable why that does happen in many organizations. The most dangerous form of culture in my mind is inauthentic. This is when you go to the careers page and it says, this is what we're all about. And you go to the break room and there's posters and people have mugs made up. But when it comes to what gets rewarded and what gets punished in an organization, if it doesn't match, that is inauthentic. And the reason that's so dangerous is because you will attract candidates on the basis of what you say you're all about. And they're going to make a job decision and they're going to shift their life and they're going to leave their old gig and they're going to choose you over their alternatives, only to come to find out that you're not about what you said you were. That can be really damaging. And so ultimately they end up leaving, and then you have a hole where you thought you didn't have a hole. So, authenticity is really, really important when it comes to cultural design. And then finally, when it comes to leading the world, I used the example a little bit earlier. We take our work home with us. And if we have a positive relationship and experience at work, we go home to our families, we're that much better. If we bring it into our communities, into society at large, into the planet, and even whatever it is that's beyond this world, these are the types of things that are possible for us And again, leadership can absolutely help us connect to them. And the example I'll give here is around community. So in this case, you see an example of a very large financial services company called Thrivent, and they partner with Habitat for Humanity. So I'm sure you've probably heard of Habitat for Humanity. They do a lot of home construction and refurbishing in order to give people who need access to housing, that type of access. And these numbers just completely blew me away. When you look at millions, hundreds of millions of dollars being donated to this program, when you look at 25,000 almost homes being provided to individuals who need them, and 6.3 million hours of volunteer time. So what happens as an employee when your employer says you can take paid work time, go into our community and swing a hammer, learn some skills, and make a difference? You're going to bring that back to your coworkers, you bring that back to your family, and you're appreciative of the organization giving you that opportunity. And so this is an example where I feel like organizations have the ability to give employees a connecting point that they may not have otherwise. I will say to you is this, fair warning, the framework itself is simple. It's very easy to understand. Okay, I start with myself and then I go expand the circle out to others, my team, my org, but it's not necessarily easy. And I think that the best way to understand that is to experience it for yourself. The code is there. If you go to menti.com, you can enter the code, or if you got a fancy phone, you can use the QR code. So here's what I'd like to do. I'm going to come to this first question here, and it's a very simple one-line answer. What is your strongest personal value? So go ahead and take a second. This could be a value. I'll give you some examples, like maybe it's adventure or creativity or service, quality. Whatever it is that comes to mind for you, go ahead and just type in a value and it's going to show up here. There's a good one. Integrity. Great word, great value. I'll give another second for people to get onto the Menti and share their example as well. It's totally anonymous. Don't worry. And I like to ask, to what degree does your current work reflect that value? So in this case, as an example, this person doesn't need to vote if they've put in integrity. But I think that if I'm working with someone like a leader in an organization or one of my direct reports, and I ask them, hey, what's an example of this value? And they say something like creativity. And I say, great, scale of 1 to 10, how is that showing up in your work? And if they tell me a 5 or they tell me a 7 or whatever they tell me, my question is, what can we do and how can we shape your work environment and what you're doing to express that a little bit more? This gets directly at that being need that we talked about a little bit earlier. How do I bring more of myself to work? Well, it has to start with self-awareness and understanding what I'm all about and how I can bring more of that to my work. So there's a movie, I probably should say spoiler alert, but it's been 28 years, so I feel safe here. When we talk about Shawshank, and there was Andy and Red were together. They met in prison. They became friends. And so Andy had left a note for Red. It said, "Dear Red, if you're reading this, you've gotten out. If you come this far, maybe you're willing to come a little further." And I said in the title of the webinar that we're going to talk about how to boost performance and maximize engagement and save the world. And here's where I'm hoping that you'll come maybe just a little further with me as well. I want to tell you real quickly my personal story. So I had hit a point where I came to this crossroads in my own leadership. And what happened is when I first started my adult life, it was in the Marine Corps. I learned leadership from a military perspective. And I was able, when I became a civilian leader, to bring that into my leadership. And it worked really, really well, I found, right up until it didn't. So I committed myself to learn the next level of leadership. And I went and I earned my PhD in psychology, where I studied leadership and coaching at the highest levels. And I brought that into my leadership. And now I was talking about teams and organizations and these things. And it worked really well too, right up until it didn't. And when I got to a certain point during the pandemic where I hit this wall, and I thought to myself, I am not reaching what I still know to be a next level in my own leadership. There's something missing. And I've started to peter out. And if it's happened to me, based on my background, it's got to be happening to other people, but how can I break through? And right around that same time, my father got a diagnosis of having a cancerous tumor on his kidney, and he's okay now. But at the time, I recognized and I said, I need to get back to a book that had been on my bookshelf for a long time, decades, and I hadn't cracked it open. And for me, the difference came in this book, which was the Tibetan Book of Living and Dying. And it made 2 points. The first point is that each of us is going to die someday. Now, that much I knew. I have been a student of life, and that I knew. But the second point that it made was that when that moment comes, in order to die well, we have to first learn how to live well. And that sent me on my butt. I recognized in that moment that I am not living well. There was something holding me back, and I went to find out what it was. And when I started to go deeper into sort of those existential questions, being, belonging, something bigger than myself, I began to find my answer. And so I started to realize that connection and compassion absolutely are the future of leadership. They're the future of how we reach people in organizations, and that we need a new framework to help us do it. But what's important to remember is that I'm in your circle. I might be an other to you. I might be in the world to you, wherever, but you're in my circle too. And when you start to overlap all the leaders in your organization, all the individuals who work in your company, even if you just take that boundary alone, there's this tremendous overlap between all of the different individuals. And while you can't see these connections, they're there. And so what happens is when you start looking at it, it starts to create this network or this web of this beautiful concept that the things that I do, if I put a little drop, for example, it's going to create ripples out. Again, like expanding the circle, these ripples start to reach out. And I want to show you a ripple that it was able, this new approach and my ability to break through for myself and when I teach other leaders and what it can do. And this is a ripple I'd like to share with you. So this is a message that a woman, a leader in her organization sent to her manager and said, wanted to thank you for challenging thought leadership, pushing our team to be our very best. I feel myself growing every single day under your leadership. Now, my question is, how many people work in your organization? How many of those leaders would be different if they were getting this type of message, and what it must feel like for them to get that message? And I'll tell you how it felt when I got this message on my mobile phone, because this is from one of my people. And I was very happy. And I wasn't happy at my accomplishments as a leader. I was happy for her because I knew she was leaning into the moment. She was really excited about the work that she was doing. And I've known enough now to realize that if I did anything right, it was a very small part of it. But more importantly, what she was experiencing was going to be taken back to the rest of my team members, her coworkers. It was going to be taken to her family. I know she has a husband and she has a young son. I know that she's active in her community, and everything got a little bit better from that tiny ripple of whatever we had as a connecting point, and that was really, really important. So again, I asked the question, if we take this framework and we start to share it with the people in our organizations and we help them break through and find their next level, and we start to help all of our employees meet those being and belonging and bigger than themselves needs, what's possible in our organizations and even in our world? Like, this stuff is absolutely connected, and we can absolutely take advantage of it if we start to change our approach to leadership and bring in that connectivity and that compassion. If you say, my organization's not ready for this, Matt, I totally get it. I totally get it. Talent optimization, I encourage you, if you go to leadwithto.com, I think, Shreya, I've got another, I know you got a couple links in there as well for the chat. But if you want to learn about talent optimization and those 4 key elements of what leaders can do in their organizations to connect business strategy and business results, it's a great place to start if you're looking to put an initial people lens on the business imperative. If you're interested in learning more about the book, well, I'm sorry, you're going to have to wait. It doesn't come out until next year. I told you I gave you an early look into my research, what I'm working on. But either way, I would love to follow. I'd love it if you were to follow me, connect with me on LinkedIn. Let me follow you back. I'm very interested in continuing the conversation there. The other thing I'll say is that this is brand new. I mentioned wet paint earlier. This is the first time I've really packaged ideas like this and have had a chance to share it. I've been thinking about it deeply for a long time. In the chat, if you want to, please just share your feedback. What resonated? What didn't? I'm in learning mode big time. And I always welcome any feedback that you might have, positive or otherwise.
But if you have any questions, please load that in the chat and I'll ask. But I do have a question overall for you, Matt. If you're talking about building a bridge between the employer and the employee. Yeah. So if you were to look at, by the way, great anecdotes there and good stories. But if you were to look at like 1 or 2 key takeaway, what do you believe majority of the managers or a large majority of the managers, maybe it's not a majority, but a large number of them are not doing? What would you say they need to be really focused on?
Yeah, I always start at the beginning, because anytime I've made assumptions, I've always been proven to be wrong. So let's start with, when we talk about leading yourself, when we think about what does a leader need to know about themselves in order to show up fully, for their people, then to me, it comes down to things like values, things like your personality preferences, because not all leaders are the same. What sort of assumptions do we have? What sort of beliefs do we foster? What's our sense of purpose? Like, why do I want to be a leader? What is it about being a leader that really makes me excited? Once I've done that, if I can help individuals through that, I find there's a tremendous need for that self-acceptance. There's so much that we try to hide from the world and say, well, I'm really not good at this, so I hope nobody finds out. There's a tremendous amount. Like, I struggled for a long, long time, decades, with imposter syndrome and being an insecure overachiever and these types of things. And I had to work really hard on those things to find the depth of my leadership. So I don't want to assume that just because somebody seems okay, that I don't at least open the door to invite them to really accept and appreciate those aspects of themselves that they may not always initially be so proud of. The second bit, though, is like, when I asked the question, I know we had some mentee issues, but if you think about what's your chief value, the most pressing value, can the leaders in your organization tell me what they are for each of their direct reports? Right? Do they know what's most important to those people? And do they know their current ratings on a scale of 1 to 10? And if it's not a 10, can they say what they're doing proactively with that employee to help them drive that number up, so they're bringing more of themselves into their work? I think managers are they have a lot more flexibility to be creative about certain percentages of the job role to really meet the employee's needs than they always take advantage of. So those are some of the most essentials, especially with early career managers, that I like to include in my coaching.
There's a question here from Susanna. How can a leader lead their team well when they're not being led well themselves?
Yeah, it makes it more challenging for sure, because you don't always have role models. And thank you for the question. I feel like if we don't have role models to aspire to, or in some cases, it might be making the environment more difficult. I think there's two situations when I see that. One is when it's temporary, meaning that maybe the organization is going through change, like a lot of companies are now, and it really heightens the need for leadership at the team level, even while the winds of change are swirling around us. So to me, it's let's double down on those things. When I talk about vision, I want to be that much more clear about the vision. I want to make sure people understand that we're going to get to the other side of it, and what that better world is going to look like on tomorrow. What about team identity? I want to make sure that they're really close to me. I keep my people very close, especially in times of change. I check in more frequently. On a good day, I'm really right there for them. And those types of things can happen. The other example is where the organization's not going through something temporary. It's just not a good organization. That's challenging. I think at that point now you're doing two things. You're trying to protect and serve your team, but you're also influencing the broader environment. And that can be pretty draining for a leader. But if there's enough opportunity and momentum that you can create, it can be very rewarding to have that positive impact even beyond your team.
There's another question here from Julie. The slide you showed with the areas where employers and employees are not in alignment was right on. Could you go back to it and prioritize them and talk about the ideas on how to address them, being valued, etc.?
In this case, it was really nice that this light blue. So again, just to orient us, so the ratings, they asked employers and they asked employees, what are the types of things that matter to you? That light blue is where the employees have said, these things are somewhat or most important to me. And the employers have downgraded or discounted that more by comparison. So I don't think that there's a prioritization that I can give, because different employees, we have to remember that leadership is an individualized effort. There can be leadership programs and some generalized approaches, but leadership always takes place between two people. Okay. So when I'm working with an individual, I'll build a bridge for you right here, Sri. I'm going to do this for Julie. You want? Don't try this at home. Here we go.
Okay.
If I sit down and I make this list and I show it to one of my direct reports and I say, hey, this bald guy was talking about some research he found. I found it pretty interesting. I have a list of things here. You tell me which of these are most important to you. I want you to put it in the meh column, or I want you to put it in the yeah, and then the heck yeah column. Okay. Let them tell you. And saying, like, valued by my organization, I don't want to assume that everybody feels that way. Clearly employers and employees in general do, but I want to know individually for my people, like, which is most, and all of a sudden, if I get somebody who says being valued by my manager, by you, that's what's most important to me. I'm sure glad I asked. So I would literally take a screenshot of this, or watch the recording, or however this works, and say, of these types of things, which is driving, for you the most. And when you start seeing like sense of belonging, having caring and trusting teammates, that's the social fabric of our organization. Being valued by the organization, valued by my manager, that's the being part of it. And the potential for advancement might be, something bigger than myself, having an impact. What are people doing outside of work? As leaders, we're like, oh, I can't really ask about outside of work. Why? Their living rooms are coming with them on the Zoom. Like, you certainly can and should ask about what's going on outside of work, respectfully. You don't want to press by any means, but you want to open a door to see if they're going to go through it, because you want to basically help them make those critical connections. So, Julie, I hope that answered your question. So we brought back up the research here. I would say that I wouldn't prioritize them myself, and even as a manager with my people, because I know my people, they're all a little bit different. I'll just ask them, and I'll say, which of these things, is driving the biggest driver for you and your satisfaction at work?
There's another question from Sophia. As an organization, if we want to rebrand our values to redevelop the culture, what would be the one best thing the leader should do in order to ensure everyone trusts it's rewarding for them?
I think that what I know about trust is that transparency begets trust. So I would be transparent about it. I would say, you know what, we've had a lot of changes, or, we have a chance to revisit our values. We're going to go through an exercise. I also would invite participation, meaning that I don't necessarily want the employees to feel like they can just pick the values, but I do want them to have some input, and I want to follow up on what they say. So as an example, if I say, well, our strategy is taking us in a new direction, we've got to become more nimble. There have been some changes in the market. So now we're going to load up on some of those values as well, about failing fast and whatever it might be. Share that with the employees and say, this is what we're thinking. How does this resonate? What's missing? What would you add? And make them a part of the process. Because I think that if you just issue top down saying, oh, we just went off to an offsite and we came back and here's the new values, it's like, oh, well, that doesn't really feel like a very participative process. And you're not going to get as much buy-in. So I definitely would make it a thing. I would definitely say there's something we're doing. We're going to revisit our values. There's a project, give it a fun code name. People love that. And then start to go through and be transparent about how you're going to approach the process. Ensure that they're going to be able to provide some input and be a party to it. And when they do give feedback, listen and incorporate it. Those would be my suggestions about that.
So when you're looking at developing your values, I know what I see or have seen is that the values come in as more as aspirational. These are the values we want to have, not what they actually have. You're talking about unintentionally displaying your values because the culture is reflective of the values, right? So when you have the culture displaying certain values, but your actual values on a poster board is completely different because it's more aspirational, right. Teamwork, and customer first, whatever you want to call it,
Yes.
But my question there is, shouldn't you use your existing culture to inform your values and then work from there instead of picking the values because that's what you saw Jeff Bezos talk about, or Warren Buffett talk about, or, whoever the next big business leader talk about?
Yeah, I think there's a lot to get into there. I feel like if we're not going to actually adhere to the values and make them stick, then we shouldn't go through the exercise at all. But I'm sensitive to just taking whatever the current values are because they may not be a fit for the strategy. And I'll give you an example. I walked into a community bank and they said, we're going to rebrand and we're going to do all this innovative stuff because our industry has changed. But they had floor to ceiling cubicles and it was dark wood everywhere, no whiteboards, and all the office doors were closed. And I said, if you're not going to change your interior design, you're not going to change this company's culture. So in that case, the old culture was out of step with where strategically they needed to go. So I think that there's a reconciliation there. If we need to be a lot more nimble and we need to be a lot more agile, then we're going to need to take on new values if the old values are about not making mistakes and punishing people for making mistakes and safety. That's just not going to make, it's easier to change your values than it is to change your strategy. So those things have to kind of go together. But I'm agreeing with your point 100%. If you're just going to put it on a poster and not adhere to it, don't even bother. But take the direction of the strategy as a big driver for what culture you need to be successful.
Yeah. Well,
Awesome.
Matt, I really appreciate it. This was such a fun webinar and discussion. This particular slide itself is amazing. I didn't actually know such thing existed, so I look forward to getting your presentation as well. So thank you so much for doing this. Really, really appreciate it.
Thanks so much for the opportunity, Sri. I really appreciate it. And thanks everybody for your time and attention today. I love it.
All right. Goodbye. Thank you.